Well, good morning to you all. A couple of things. First of all, it's so great to have Matt and his kids back here. It's good to see them. And secondly, I thank God for whoever he made invent air conditioning. Now the Philadelphia summer is here. Today's reading is Psalm 6. Lord, do not rebuke me in your anger or discipline me in your wrath. Have mercy on me, Lord, for I am faint. Heal me, Lord, for my bones are in agony. My soul is in deep anguish. How long, Lord? How long? Turn, Lord, and deliver me. Save me because of your unfailing love. Among the dead, no one proclaims your name, who praises you from the grave. I am worn out from my groaning. All night long I flood my bed with weeping and drench my couch with tears. My eyes grow weak with sorrow. They fell because of all my foes. Away from me, all of you who do evil, for the Lord has heard my weeping. The Lord has heard my cry for mercy. The Lord accepts my prayer. All my enemies will be overwhelmed with shame and anguish. They will turn back and suddenly be put to shame. Here ends this morning's reading.
You know, it just occurred to me that we didn't introduce Matt. I thought it might be good to do that because we probably got a number of people here that actually don't know him. Matt Wolf is our guest speaker today. For those of you who are not familiar with Matt, Matt was a member of this congregation for over 5 years. And Matt actually was a school teacher. But through the course of his conversion and his growth, really made a life-changing decision that he believed he was called into ministry. He went and obtained his Master of Divinity degree and then basically abandoned his career. About a year ago, became the minister of a congregation in Minnesota, and I cannot remember the name of the town. It's like this long, right? Yeah, there you go. What he said. And so Matt's been serving there as minister for about a year. He and Michelle and the family made the decision to come into Philadelphia for vacation for a couple of weeks. I'm assuming it has something to do with being right around the time the Eagles go to training camp, but I don't know. So once we found that out, we did what you always do with a preacher who's on vacation. You ask him to preach. And so that's why we have Matt with us today. We are thrilled that you are back with us. It's great to have you, and we'll turn it over to you.
You good, Bob? Okay. Hello, everyone. Wow, this is neat. 16 months I've been gone, and look at all this change. We got this new little podium going on, and Kayla Roberts is driving, and Addie's in high school. It's just amazing what's going on. Not quite yet, right? I do have to mention two things that have nothing to do with the sermon. Number one, go to Honduras. If you can go to Honduras and you have not been there, you need to go. Life-changing event. I'm not kidding. I truly believe that was the key, at least in my life, to me continuing on my path toward ministry. I really think it's so critical to get out of your comfort zone in so many areas of life. If you have not been on this trip, you gotta go. And you can get a week off of work, and that's really good. But Mark and Jason, everybody, they do an incredible job. If you're not familiar with Mission Lazarus, take a few moments and do some research. It's a fascinating organization, and it will change, if nothing else, it'll change your perspective. So that's number one. And number two, and I have to say this is the first time I've been here since Jack passed. And I do miss him. I miss him almost every day, and I'm sure you guys do too. And quite honestly, it is not the same without him. Personally speaking, he was the first person I met here. It was a Wednesday night, and he talked and talked and talked and talked and talked about me, but also about him, and about how he was sick, and he was struggling, and he's a medical miracle. And by the end of the meal, we had somehow forged a date to go water skiing at his house. that ended extremely badly for me. I think Jack's still laughing about that from above. But, you know, he's definitely missed. I'm so grateful that you guys put the video of the service, of the funeral service, on YouTube. It was absolutely breathtaking. It was so beautiful. And I know Mark and Paul said some words, and Alexis, who's singing, is just otherworldly. And of course, Daniel came and made some great comments. And if I'm leaving anyone out, I apologize. But boy, a lot of change has happened here. And it's really good to be back and to be able to preach in the place where actually I was baptized. That's a blessing, and not every preacher gets to say that. But it is good to be here. And before you scoff at the Minnesota weather, let me just say this. Today, in Wilmer, Minnesota, and you can look it up, the high is 88 and the high here is 87. There you go. Well, I'm grateful for the opportunity to preach here. And because of that, I wanted to give you a gift of a very depressing text of the 6th Psalm. It's not the most heartwarming and enlightening thing you'll ever read, but it is critical. And I'm really happy that Mark talked about David this morning, because I'm going to talk a little bit about him today. No secret, it's been a tough week. These things happen every week, but for whatever reason, it seems to be escalating in this country quite a bit. The topic of pain, nobody really wants to talk about it. It's like talking about heaven and hell or death. Who wants to hear that? But pain is a reality. And though I'm pretty sure none of us are experiencing physical pain from what happened this week, there's certainly a lot of emotional pain, and there's mental anguish, and there's spiritual pain. And the reason I'm saying this, I've gone on Facebook and Twitter and a couple comment sections of people that I know just to hear what they have to say about this. And there's so many men, women, children who are saying things like, I don't know how to handle this. What do I do now? The world's going to, you know what? What do I do? The common denominator of all these people was that none of them are Christians. None of them have Christ in their life. Now, I'm not saying just because you are a Christian, these things won't bother you. In fact, they should bother you. It's still bothering me what's going on in this country. Here's the difference. The perspective that you have as a Christian is so different from what you have if you're not a Christian. And I say that, I'm staying with a few people this week who are not Christians. I had a lunch date yesterday with someone who is a non-believer, and we talked about some of these difficult topics. I'm going to say something, and I think it's really important to listen, because I'm going to repeat it again at the end. As a Christian, you do not await death. You await life. It doesn't mean we are not affected at all by death. Of course we are. And Michelle's not here, and boy, she wishes she was. Honestly, she had a South Carolina trip scheduled months before we knew we were going to come here. But she sends her love. And she always says, whenever tragedy strikes, how do you handle this if you don't have Christ in your life? And if you know Michelle, that's serious growth on her end for saying that. So major props there. Even with Jesus in your life, it's still hard to figure out just what is going on in the world. Pain is something that C.S. Lewis wrote about. Actually, the title of today's sermon is The Problem of Pain. I don't know if you've heard of that book. C.S. Lewis wrote that in 1940. Among other things, he tackles some issues such as this. If God were good, then he would want all his creatures, us, to be perfectly happy. If God were omnipotent, if he were all-powerful, he could do whatever he wanted. Take a look around. Is every single one of his creatures perfectly happy? I would say almost the opposite, especially if you're not a churchgoer. Most people are perfectly miserable, or at least averagely miserable, right? So, with that in mind, either God lacks goodness or he lacks omnipotence, or both. That's the problem of pain. If we are to admit that pain exists in the world, of course it does, how in the world can we attribute creation to a benevolent creator? Now, I posed that question to a few non-believers. I got two responses. Number one, we can't, because God is not benevolent. It's not me saying that, that's someone else. And the other person said, well, God did create the world, but then he kind of he backed off. They call that deist. In other words, God creates the world, it creates you, and then he just doesn't care and he lets you do whatever you want. And I'll say this, it's hard to argue sometimes why someone might feel that way when you watch the news for a half hour a night. But we know better, because our home is so much greater than the walls of this church and the walls of our actual houses. There's so much out there. But pain is real, and we handle it in different ways. I was reading about a New Yorker who happened to be driving through Texas, and he collided with a truck, and the truck was carrying a few horses. Remember that for a second. About 3 weeks later, this New Yorker was at his nice luxury condo in Manhattan, and he decided to call his insurance agent to try to make a claim. So the agent gets on the phone and says, first of all, why did you wait 3 weeks to call me? And number two, at the time of the accident, you said you were perfectly fine, according to the police report. You didn't report any injuries at all. What happened? And the man said, look, I was writhing in pain. I was dying. I was on the ground, my knees, my legs. But then I saw that there was a horse lying next to me who had broken his leg. And the next thing I know, this Texas Ranger pulls out his pistol and shoots the horse right next to me, put him out of the misery. And then he turns to me and asks, hey, are you okay? The moral, as always, don't drive in Texas, but that's another story. But pain is real, even if it's not physical pain. Now, we talked about King David this morning. King David was a man after God's own heart. He was the anointed one, but guess what? He made mistakes. He was probably not the father of the year, and yeah, that whole Bathsheba incident, that didn't go too well. He was a man, as you see in today's text in Psalm 6, and if you're not there, you can turn there. This is a man who wrestled with God. Not like Jacob, who literally wrestled with God. David wrestled with God. Do you wrestle with God? Of course you do. Now, if you do, that is an okay thing, because if you're wrestling with God, at least you're in contact with him. The worst thing in the world is to throw up your hands in the air, especially as a Christian, and say, you know what, this is too big for me, and it's probably too big for God, so I don't care anymore. I'm done. I give up. I'll say this about David, and he had some issues, but giving up, that was not one of them. There are a lot of emotions in this text. Anguish, anger, talks about flooding my bed with weeping and tears. And as we'll see in a few moments, toward the end of the psalm, he kind of turns it around a little bit, and life is good again. We'll get to why momentarily. The key point here, and this may be blasphemous, is that in this text, God is both David's problem and his solution. When you think about that, look at the very first verse. And I'm using the NIV. Lord, do not rebuke me in your anger, or discipline me in your wrath. There's a little bit of why me in there, and we know how that is. Why me, God? Why now? Why cancer? I'm supposed to go travel next week. You can't give me that diagnosis. I can. So David understands, I think to a certain degree, that he's really not in control. And by the way, I forgot to mention, and this is important too, a lot of these psalms are actually used as songs. This is one of them. I don't know about you, but when I'm crying, I'm not singing out to God. I'm not singing out to anybody if I'm crying. In fact, if I did start singing, other people would start crying. But I digress. Again, 1, do not rebuke me in your anger. Now, does that mean do not rebuke me by means of your anger, or because you are angry? Old Testament theology will point to the former. This is a God of mercy. It's a God of grace, but it's also a God of wrath. I want to read a couple Old Testament texts for you. Number 1, Proverbs 3, verses 11 and 12. Do not despise the Lord's discipline, and do not resent his rebuke, because the Lord disciplines those he loves. And then Job chapter 5, 17 and 18. This is his friend Eliphaz talking. Blessed is the one whom God corrects. So do not despise the discipline of the Almighty. For he wounds, but he also binds up. He injures, but his hands also heal. This is a God. It's more than rainbows and sunshine and bunnies and happy endings. This is a God who disciplines us with tough love. Anyone who has children probably knows a thing or two about that. We're not supposed to spare the rod, Solomon says. I love when, and I guess you can't do this anymore in these days and age, but when an old school father would kind of take out a belt and say, son, this is going to hurt me a lot more than it's going to hurt you. Just one time I want the boy to turn around and say, you know what, Dad? I seriously doubt that. But Old Testament theology, Job's friends, you know who I'm talking about, they get a bad rap. Some of it's deserved. But here's the thing. If we were all alive back then, we would have said the same exact things. Sin is a sickness, and that is why you lost your family, Job. That is why you lost your business. You lost all your money. That's why you have all these painful sores from head to toe, because you must have done something wrong. Now, is that true? Was Job a crazy sinner? What does God himself say about Job? There's no one on earth like him. He shuns anger. He fears God. He is blameless. He's upright. That doesn't sound like a man who gets what he deserves. And by the way, you should thank God every single day that you don't get what you deserve. You think we'd really be here right now if we all got what we deserved? As we move on in this text, we're just going to go through it a little bit. 2 through 5. It says, have mercy on me, Lord, for I am faint. Heal me, Lord, for my bones are in agony. My soul is in deep anguish. How long, Lord? How long? Turn, Lord, and deliver me. Save me because of your unfailing love. Among the dead, no one proclaims your name. Who praises you from the grave? This is what's called a lamentation psalm. If you're not sure what that is, well, it is what it says. It's a psalm of lament. Having not been here for a while, I still receive friends' newsletter updates, and it's amazing. It never ceases to amaze me, regardless of the size of the church, whether it's 100, 200, 8,000, or 40. The prayer list never seems to go down, does it? I mean, it's good that we're praying, but we have a lot of lamenting people, is what I'm trying to say. And whether it's the Bauer family, or Vanessa, or Rebecca, or Tony, and anyone else I left out, let me ask you this. When you are lamenting something, does that mean you lack faith? What does it mean? You lack what? You lack answers. I'll bring up Jack one more time if I could. He used to tell me that people would tell him, well, the reason you're not healing faster is because you don't have faith. I mean, come on, really? Give me a break. It's one thing to not have faith. It's a completely different deal to not have all the answers. And we don't have all the answers. And you know what? Are you comfortable with that? If not, you need to learn to be, because we're just not going to have all the answers. And that is okay. God is the author of life, but he's also the overseer of death. Our problems, and some of them are huge. What happened the other night in Dallas, as big as that was, you do realize, in the grand scheme of things, in God's eyes, right? It's not that big. There are so many other things going on. Mark, you told me once, Christaldi, you told me once that all God has to do is this, and that'll change your life. And it's so true. We are so small. We are so tiny. And if you don't believe me, Eliza and I went to the Flaming Pine Youth Camp last week, which is Minnesota's version of Manatawny. I would argue it's probably a lot colder there, 265 miles north of where we live. So you're getting close to Canada, eh? And It was a wonderful experience. Eliza, you talk about getting out of your comfort zone. She was a rock star, so give her a high five later. Anyway, she did a wonderful job. I was blessed enough to teach that week. But the point is this. About midnight, 1 a.m., I don't know how it is at Manatawny, but you have to walk out of the cabins in order to use the restroom. I'm telling you, 2 nights in a row, it looked like a video game with the stars in the sky. And I'm not an expert in this field at all, but I mean, if you can look at that and somehow still believe that you're this big, and still believe that God doesn't have a hand in all that goes on in your life, I don't know what to tell you. It was honestly one of the most, and I wish I could have taken a picture, but cell phones in the dark, it wasn't going to happen. But it was absolutely breathtaking. Suffice to say, I had to go to the bathroom a lot more those 2 nights, but that's okay. It was just awesome. The world really, at the beginning of time, was not supposed to be like this. What did God, well, actually, it was Moses. In Genesis 1:31, God saw that he created, and it was very average. It was very bad. It was okay. No, it was very good. I'll tell you, when God said something is good, that's a lot different from when you and I say something is good. That was a good cup of coffee I just had this morning. Not the same thing as God created a good world. Who messed it up? We talked about that in class this morning. We messed it up. Sin messed it up. We introduced sin into the world. We introduced death into the world. And I hate to say it, we introduced pain into the world. I'm not a statistics major, but I know this. 1 out of every 1 person will die. It's hard to believe. For some reason in college, I had to take a statistics class. I'll be honest, I still don't know why. A friend and I were struggling, and we went to see the teacher after class, the professor, and he said, look, I'm going to try to make this easy for you. Takes out a deck of cards. He said, what are the odds of you randomly picking the Queen of Hearts? So, in his infinite wisdom, my friend says, it's easy, 50-50. And I'm looking at him like, what? He says, yeah, either you will or you won't. One, we will all die. It's a difficult to swallow statistic, but it's very true. I'll look at verse 4 once more. Turn, Lord, and deliver me. Save me because of your unfailing love. Unfailing love. Sometimes when you read Scripture, many times, it loses its effect on you. Now, fortunately, I'm still relatively new to this game, and it still makes me want to jump with excitement when I read something like that. You should never take it for granted. Go read Philippians 2, 5, 6 times tonight, just because. And I promise you, you will feel better about whatever your situation is. It's simple things like that. I was listening to K-Love the other day, and I actually had to stop the car. Someone called up and said something to the effect of, I love going through difficult times. I love going through difficult times because that's when God really shines through. I'm fine with the second part of that. I love when God shines through in my life. But do I have to go through difficult times in order for that to happen? I'd say sometimes yes. I mean, can we honestly feel this way? David had such a unique relationship with God. It was almost as if it was a father-son relationship. But our spiritual growth will not expand if the sun is shining, or we have a lot of money in our accounts, or everybody in your family is healthy and happy. Thanks, God, you're the best. Well, what happens if it's raining and all of a sudden you don't have enough money to pay that bill? Or you lose that job, or people in your family are dying of cancer. Is it still the same God? You bet it is. How do you feel about that God, though, during that difficult circumstance? It is the same God. You maintain contact with him regardless. And that's what David is trying to say here. This, during your adversity, when the hidden resources of your inner character are revealed, how are you going to approach that problem? How are you going to conquer that pain? This is when God becomes very real. Let's finish this out. 6 through 10. I am worn out from my groaning. All night long I flood my bed with weeping and drench my couch with tears. My eyes grow weak with sorrow. They fail because of all my foes. Away from me, all you who do evil, for the Lord has heard my weeping. The Lord has heard my cry for mercy. The Lord accepts my prayer. All my enemies will be overwhelmed with shame and anguish. They will turn back and suddenly be put to shame. There's a lot there. We don't have time to completely parse it out. David suddenly realizes, okay, if I can get away from some of these evildoers, maybe I can start doing some good things. Maybe some better things will start happening. He also talks, and this to me is just an unbelievable image here. Flood my bed with weeping? Drench my couch with tears? Have we ever done that? Be honest, you are in church. Have we ever done that? Yeah, of course. We can relate to that. We can relate to that feeling of utter hopelessness. We can relate to being broken. But can we relate to being unforgiven? And that is the scariest thing of it all. I've said this before in here. Heaven, it's not a place for good people. It's a place for forgiven people. There is nothing worse than being unforgiven. And no matter what you are going through today, know this. If you have received the Lord, you are a forgiven man, a forgiven woman, a forgiven child. And that is the key point, should be the key point, of any sermon. But as far as, and yes, David knows you're only as good as the company you keep sometimes. And it's important for us to affect the world with our Christian beliefs and behavior. But at the same time, you have to be careful. Because what does Paul say in 1 Corinthians 15:33? Do not be misled. Bad company corrupts good character. These words sound like a man who has a good relationship with God. These words sound like a man who has been broken. And if you've ever been to a rehabilitation facility, and I'm assuming not a whole lot of people have, they will break you down. They will break you down for the express purpose of raising you back up. You have to be broken down in order to be reborn. That's what happens when you go in that water and you're born again. You are broken down. You ever think of that? That is an unbelievably powerful statement. The darkness that David feels finally turns to light. We see that in verse 8 more than anything. Now, when I first read this, I started thinking, David's got some issues because he's happy, he's sad, he's angry, he's not. He's all over the place. But what happens when we're vulnerable? What happens when we're going through something tragic? Do we just stay in one mental spot the whole time, emotionally? I don't. I think that's perfectly normal what David has to go through right now. Can we relate to him? And regarding keeping company and doing the right things and keeping in contact with God, the very first words of the entire Psalter, and if you know it, say it with me, Psalm 1:1. Blessed is the man who, all right, I'll say it, who does not walk in step with the wicked, or stand in the way that sinners take, or sit in the company of mockers. And David wrote that. David knew that. It's so important for us to keep company with God because our people, our friends, even our family, they're going to change. That relationship we have with the Lord, whether we're wrestling with Him or not, will never, ever change. And finally, in verses 9 and 10, we see a very positive David. Here's how I know he's positive. Will be. All my enemies will be overwhelmed. Does that sound like someone who has faith? What did Moses say before the Israelites crossed the Red Sea? He said, these Egyptian people, you see them right now? Guess what? You're never going to see them again after today. That was faith. He didn't read God's mind, but he knew that God would deliver. I want to read Joshua 8, 1 through 2. This is from the New Revised Standard. Do not fear or be dismayed. take all the fighting men with you and go up now to Ai. See, I have handed over to you the king of Ai with his people, his city, and his land. See, S-E-E. That's one of those throwaway words that you've probably read a million times and didn't think much of it. When you see that, that points to faith. We always hear that phrase, seeing is believing. I'm going to turn that around. Believing is seeing. How do we apply this, though? Abraham Lincoln, who's just incredibly quotable, I love him. He said once about a sermon, he said, the sermon wasn't great because the preacher did not ask me to do anything great. Fair enough. I'm going to ask you to do a few things that are great, none of which are very difficult. Number one, you need to challenge yourself to hold on to whatever feeling you have in this particular room right now. Here's what I mean. I have no idea what happened to you this morning on the way to church. Clearly, we don't know what's going to happen after church today. If you listen, you can feel the presence. You can feel the presence of God. We know this because we are all assembled together as Christians. Hold on to that feeling. Hold on to the love that you have in these rooms. Maybe it's only for a few minutes. Maybe it's for hours. Don't let go of that until you absolutely want to or you absolutely have to. We are people who suffer. We are people who are in pain. I think I've told you this before, too. Before I was a Christian, I used to think, well, if I get converted, I'll never have to deal with adversity again. Is that true? Everybody says, no, of course not. But remember who else suffered. And remember who else suffered for you. That would be Jesus Christ. Yet, while he knew he was going to suffer, what was his promise? He says, come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. What a promise. Now, God gives us the ability to have our wounds, to have our broken spirit, to have our broken promises. He takes those and he uses these to help heal others. We can't do it on our own. But I guarantee you let God into your heart, he will teach you how to do that. And that is an important thing to do. What does James say? Jesus' own brother, James 1, 2 through 4. Consider it pure joy whenever you face trials of many kinds. Because testing of faith produces what? Perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking in anything. That is a hard pill to swallow. I love James. Wow, what a great book. That being said, God did not give us ideas on salvation. He didn't give us, quote unquote, a blueprint. And he certainly didn't give us self-help seminars. What did he give us? He gave us himself. He came down here. He sent his son to come as God incarnate in flesh. Are you kidding me? Do you have any idea how real that is? He emptied himself. He was sitting on the throne of heaven, enjoying life. And then said, you need to go down there and take care of that mess. Would anyone want to do that once you get to heaven? You want to come back here? I don't think so either. Again, I'll talk about Philippians 2 one more time. What does he say? He emptied himself by taking the very nature of a servant, by becoming human likeness. He made himself nothing. This is the King of Kings. This is the Lord of Lords. He made himself nothing. Any of you want to do that anytime soon? No. You need to get out of your bubble. I talked earlier about Honduras. That's one thing you can do. But how else do we get out of our comfort zone? How else do we attract people to this church? You need to be able, and I'm not saying you need to get a bullhorn and start yelling at people because you're sinners and you're all going to hell. That usually doesn't work, that type of evangelism, not in 2016. But how hard is it for you to share your testimony? You're nothing. Nothing is more powerful than your personal testimony. Yes, The good news, the Bible, very powerful, no question. But if I've never read the Bible, am I going to respond more to a verse or to someone's testimony? Right? All you need to do, instead of talking to people and say, listen, this is what Jesus did for you, and if you don't believe me, you're going to hell. And by the way, we have church at 10:30. You want to come? That's not going to work. You say, now that I've told you the gospel, do you now hate that sin that you once loved? Are you ready to take that next step? Because as I said at the beginning, as Christians, we do not await death. We await life. We receive reviving power. There's a woman in Minnesota. She does not belong to our church. She knows what I do, though. And she always tells me I'm a nice guy. Thank you. And then she starts saying things like, if I ever go to a church, I want to go to yours because you're going to preach a good, nice, kind, clean gospel. And I'm thinking, oh man, if you ever came to our church, you'd probably be out the door within 10 minutes. And that's the point. It's a scandalous thing. Whoever you hire here, he better not come up here and say things you want to hear. It's not about that. It's a scandalous gospel. You're going to offend some people telling them about this. You realize that, right? It's going to be offensive. But you know what? You may offend 30 people, and that 31st person, you may save their life. That's how I got started. It is real. It happens. We don't need to disguise this 2,000-year-old faith as some hip, cool, popular thing. Let me tell you something. You're going to give your life to Christ. You're not going to be cool and popular in your school or amongst your friends. It's not going to happen. But you'll be saved. Maybe we're not relevant in the eyes of the world, but we are relevant in the eyes of God. And these, see, now I'm getting hot here. These articles that you read about, oh, the church is dying, and the Church of Christ in particular is terrible, and they should all be banished. And really? Come on. We don't need to be relevant because our culture is relevant. We need to be relevant because we're not like our culture, not because we're like our culture. And I'll tell you what, I'd much rather follow what it says in this book than what anyone on the radio or on Facebook or on Twitter has to tell me. When you die, one of two things are going to happen. You're either going to experience alienation from God or acceptance of God. I don't know about you, but the latter sounds a whole lot better than the former. I never thought I'd quote Woody Allen in a sermon, but here goes. Woody Allen, who best of my knowledge is not a believer, says, I'm not afraid to die. I just don't want to be there when it happens. You're going to be there when it happens. The question is, where are you going to be after it happens? Not everyone is saved. It's scary. Everyone dies, but not everybody lives. You see what I'm saying? And not everybody matters as much as they should when they do live. You got to pick someone. Someone had to come up in your head today while I was speaking. Who can you find? Who can you talk to? Who can you maybe save? And if you yourself have not been baptized, this is the time to do it. It's a crazy world in which we live. You're not guaranteed anything. If you're too embarrassed to come talk to me or someone after church, I understand that. But at least get the conversation started. This will be the most important step you ever take in your life. Thank you so much again for letting me speak. Thank you, Paul and Mark. Everybody have a wonderful, wonderful week, and we'll stand and sing.
Let's all stand, please.